Who am I? You sure you want to know? The story of my life is not for the faint of heart. If somebody said it was a happy little tale, if somebody told you I was just your average ordinary guy, not a care in the world, somebody lied. 15 years later. So, May 3rd, 2002, one of the greatest superheroes of all time makes his very first feature film debut. And here we are, May 3rd, 2017. It's the 15th anniversary since the Spider-Man film franchise began. Now, at the time of this video's creation, it's been over 15 years since the Spider-Man film franchise started, and 15 years since the first Spider-Man movie debuted in 2002, making over $400 million at the box office in its original box office run and such, and is of course still critically acclaimed as one of the greatest superhero movies ever made. You know, guys, times have really flown since we're in the current state of Hollywood's current obsession with superhero movies being in shared universes. But back in the time when Spider-Man came out, as well as the rest of Sam Raimi's trilogy of Spider-Man, Hollywood didn't believe in doing shared universes, although Marvel has. I mean, can you believe during the 2000s that we've had so many movies with all of these characters from Marvel, including characters we didn't even care about, like Daredevil and Elektra and the Fantastic Four, get their own movies during that same time, in that same time frame, in the entire decade. At the same time, X-Men and Spider-Man were both growing as two of the most competitive film franchises Marvel has ever put out there by their respective distributors. Fox had X-Men and Sony had Spider-Man. It's been a long time, guys, and now, also, just to let you guys know, this is actually a remaster of one of my movie rants about Spider-Man. And as a matter of fact, this is a re-recording of the Movie Rant video about the Sam Raimi movies of Spider-Man that I originally posted in 2014 on my YouTube channel. If you want to see my original Spider-Man movie rant video that I posted from 2014, check it out. It's on my channel and it still exists. However, this is a re-recording of that video, but with things altered, and with statements I made back then are probably forgotten about, so I'm going to make up for it anyway by adding in new material that wasn't added in the original video years prior. Anyway, now, Spider-Man is that one character that I've always had some admiration for to appear on screen. And actually, as a matter of fact, though, when I was a kid in the 1990s, and actually being born in 1992, Spider-Man the animated series didn't come around until 1994, ended almost near 20 years later in 1998. You know, back in the time in my childhood when I was watching Batman the Animated Series, Animaniacs, X-Men, and Power Rangers, Spider-Man had his 90s cartoon treatment that same time in that same decade on Fox Kids. Around that time, however, Spider-Man and other Marvel properties were struggling to appear in their own big screen debut films, first being mostly legitimately Blade in 1998 starring Wesley Snipes. And around this time, this is long before I even knew about the history of how long it took for them to make a Spider-Man movie. Well, basically, Spider-Man was an unexpected surprise. After all, I spent half of my childhood in my late childhood around age 8 to 10 watching the very first X-Men movie by Bryan Singer. Now, to be honest though, X-Men, the first one from 2000, was a great installment. Although some things from the first movie kind of don't hold up now than it was back over 15, 16, 17 years ago. While X2, the sequel to Bryan Singer's X-Men, is actually the more better film of the two movies that he has done. And I actually like the X2 than I did the first one. Hence the John Ottman music and also the heavy acting chops that the actors, that have been in the X-Men movies for years, especially with Bryan Singer involved as director, had done. But when it came to Spider-Man, I mean, after X-Men's big success, then came their other most popular comic book property by Marvel, Spider-Man. Now, Spider-Man, looking back on this 15 years later, or 15 years ago, it was hard to tell that I didn't expect Spider-Man to have his own live-action film. Yes, Blade and X-Men were very successful and brought new faith into the comic book genre in Hollywood in terms of adapting these comic book characters to life on the big screen. After all, Hollywood had been in limbo ever since Joel Schumacher's Batman and Robin came out in 1997, and yes, it's been over 20 years since Batman and Robin has been in theaters, and been over 20 years since the initial Batman film franchise died, until 8 years later, in retrospect, when Christopher Nolan took the helms to reboot Batman with his ever-acclaimed trilogy. But before Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy, there was one particular superhero trilogy that I've been admired the most. Before, I was like, oh, Nolan's Batman trilogy is better than somebody's trilogy of a Marvel comic web-slinging superhero, which is false. Actually, Spider-Man was actually my first favorite superhero trilogy, because the stakes were kind of higher until Spider-Man 3, and then, well, come Thursday, at the time this video is recording, it's 10 years after Spider-Man 3 is released May 4th. So, yeah. But I really wanted to talk about the film that started the entire, big screen journey of Spider-Man, and really where it took off. Now, I'm not gonna spend my entire day talking about this long and if not complicated history of Marvel trying to bring Spider-Man to the big screen back since 1985, and back in between 1985 to 1999, 2000, and so when it took Marvel and such so long to bring Spider-Man on screen after trying to propose the idea of the proposed movie of Spider-Man that could have been made back when Marvel tried to have some luck, and back when Hollywood scoffed at the fact that comic book publishers would think that Hollywood would make movies of their characters, but yet Marvel has had low budget films of their respective characters before, and you know how much they've croaked at the box offices and they've been scoffed at. Captain America in 1990, Punisher in 1991 or 92 or so, before the Thomas Jane version of Punisher, and of course the if not completely forgettable and unreleased Fantastic Four film from 1994 that never sought to the light of day to be released in 1994. Yeah, and with a version of the Thing that looks like a low-budget Ninja Turtle, if that was the Thing, if he was ever part of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Yeah, I'm joking. Sorry. But, again, it's been complicated for Marvel, and then also hearing all of these, hearing that long, complicated history of all these different directors and producers and stuff wanting to do that Spider-Man film, and then with low-budget film studios like 21st Century Films until they all went bankrupt, and Canon Films. It's a long, complicated history, folks. And then also hearing, surprisingly, one of the most popular pieces of pre-Spider-Man movie history is James Cameron, who you may know for directing the Terminator movies and the Terminator movies and Titanic and such, and Avatar. We would never guess that if he was to direct that Spider-Man movie, if he were to have Leonardo DiCaprio, who he would later have in the Titanic, which has been over 20 years now, then the movie would have been like, I don't know, because back in the 90s, Leonardo DiCaprio was such a huge heartthrob in the 90s. A lot of girls and women couldn't get enough of Leo. And now, if Leonardo DiCaprio was Spider-Man to begin with, instead of his longtime friend, who actually eventually won the role and ended up why he was the more famous, even the more famous Tobey Maguire. Yeah. Here's the thing, guys. Now let's talk about the actual film history. If you want to see, hear me do a complete coverage of movie history of how long it took Spider-Man to get to the big screen, that video will probably come when it comes and when I have it out. So let's talk about the movie itself. After Spider-Man went through 25 years of development hell to be made into a feature film, Sony required the rights to Spider-Man in 1999 or 2000, either way around. And then there was following words, they've already gathered some scripts that was, from the rejected assets and scripts of what could have been part of, and even including the James Cameron pitch of the Spider-Man movie with the organic web shooters, which was, of course, controversial to some extent. And then you would have some other, potential villains involved, what villains they wanted to adapt for this movie, and yeah, onward and onward. However, and then David Koepp was hired hired as screenwriter. He only wrote one Spider-Man movie, and that's surprisingly well. And also, according to the Wikipedia article, Alvin Sargent, the husband of the late Laura Ziskin, who has been producer of the first 3 Spider-Man films and The Amazing Spider-Man respectively, was listed as an uncredited writer on the first Spider-Man film, according to Wikipedia. Look it up. And I just think that with David Koepp being involved in writing the script, I mean, there was also another writer, however, it's just like, this is all what I'm seeing on Wikipedia, and however. Now, in terms of directors for Spider-Man, now Sony was lining up what directors would have directed this Spider-Man movie if it was made. There were so many, including Chris Columbus, who would later go ahead Chris Columbus was one of the few film director as potential, choices to direct the Spider-Man film. But due to some fallout, he decided to work on the very first installment of the Harry Potter franchise instead. Then there had been so many other directors, even Tim Burton, Roland Emmerich, and so on. I never guessed that half of those guys would go ahead and be involved if they were going to be directors. But again, if any of those directors, especially, I would have been damned if Roland Emmerich directed Spider-Man. The movie would have been the disaster. Look what happened do anybody remember when he ruined Godzilla in 1998? That Godzilla was no Godzilla. It was basically Jurassic Park in New York. And I know, I've been saying that a lot lately. But surprisingly, though, one of the more popular film director choices, someone that we have been known in particular for directing a film trilogy prior to Spider-Man, that revolved around Bruce Campbell facing an army of Deadites and such in the Book of the Dead. Yes, Sam Raimi himself, the guy who made The Evil Dead, Quick of the Dead, Dark Man, and that underrated Keanu Reeves and Cate Blanchett movie that came out a year before Spider-Man, was chosen to direct the film based on the character. Now, the reason why Raimi got the job for directing Spider-Man was because Raimi in his private life has been a fan of the character since his youth, and even also had over 25,000 comic books in his collection. So yeah, Sam Raimi has been a comic book fan for years, and also having the more admiration for Spider-Man. I figured that having him being the director was a smart choice, for Sony and Marvel, because Raimi has always been a Spider-Man fan. So I figured having him directed was actually one of the reasons why I've always had admiration for Raimi and the things he has done in the movies and stuff that he's produced, directed, etc., etc. However, though, Raimi is also, when Raimi was approached to direct Spider-Man as well as the 2 sequels that followed, he was more inspired by the 1960s, 1970s comics of Spider-Man, from that being the original Amazing Spider-Man comics. And I figured that's why, because considering you can tell that if he collected those comics over his entire lifetime, he really wanted to go by that era of Spider-Man. No wonder the aesthetics and the visuals and the concept and the execution of the films, the entire trilogy in general, have completely been inspired by those original Old Amazing Spider-Man comics written by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, and then other writers who have also done other Spider-Man comics during the time when Spider-Man was just growing to be a very, very popular comic book icon, and even to this day. And also, the movie was, and considering 2002 was the year the first movie was released, I would forbiddingly miss if I'm not mistaken to mention 2002, 15 years ago, was the year Spider-Man turned 40, and the movie was released in time for Spider-Man's 40th anniversary. Much like 1989 was, when Tim Burton released his first Batman movie in 1989, it was released to honor Batman's 50th anniversary. Yeah, I looked it up on that 2020 behind the scenes, 2020 documentary featurette on the Tim Burton movie of Batman. Oh, it's on YouTube somewhere. Go look it up. And I figured that's exactly how I would have never guessed that Spider-Man was that old. I didn't think of that. Now, anyway, back to my my knowledge of Spider-Man and my nostalgia. In terms of how I grew up in my passing knowledge of the character for years. Okay, anyway, back when I was a kid in the 1990s, I wasn't that big of a fan of Spider-Man, and to be honest though, I thought Spider-Man Spider-Man was a stupid superhero. No, just don't get me wrong. As time grew on, the 1990s Spider-Man animated series that we had back in the 90s that was on Fox Kids, again, the same time Power Rangers, X-Men the animated series, and other shows that was on Fox Kids in the 90s, is still a great show, and Spider-Man the animated series itself still holds up. And the thing is, I wasn't a big fan of the character. I thought Spider-Man was stupid, and I thought that, I mean, it's just, oh, seriously, a guy who was bitten by a spider, get these spider-like abilities, fight supervillains that are so over the top for their taste, and then it's like blah blah blah. But that's what I thought. But no, Spider-Man actually is a great character. It's just, well, again, when I was a little kid, I couldn't really get into Spider-Man because I was more of an X-Men, Batman kind of guy. I didn't fully, up to this point, 15 years ago, and even 15 years later now, for the rest of my entire life, I have became a Spider-Man fan until this live-action film based on the character arrived. And also, even when years after Spider-Man the animated series ended, I did get the video game I did get the PlayStation 1 video game of Spider-Man that was made by Neversoft, the guys who created the Tony Hawk Pro Skater games and other Tony Hawk games, and I never guessed that Neversoft would do a Spider-Man game that was like, with the same graphics engine as the Tony Hawk Pro Skater games, but Spider-Man licensed. Now, I remember, playing that game, and yeah, the game, in terms of storyline with the Spider-Man versus Venom stuff, it kind of still holds up for an old PS1 Dreamcast N64 game of the character. And then I remember in late 2001, when I still had the original PlayStation, because I wasn't fully aware of PS2 back then a little yet, that I played a demo of Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro, and I can only play like 2 or 3 levels of that. And then 2002 came along. I remember I went to a grocery store, and this was like long after my mom. This was like less than 6 months after my mom died in 2001, early 2002. I remember going to one of my local grocery stores and picking up boxes of cereal, and surprisingly, one of those boxes of cereal has Spider-Man on it. And I would never guess 15 years ago when I went to I guess a local Giant or Safeway store, going to a grocery store, finding a box of Frosted Flakes or crispy Rice Krispies or so. Actually, it was a box of Rice Krispies, and they had Spider-Man on it, and it looked like a Spider-Man variant for like a video game or something, until I came to realize it was actually for this. And then also with the way how the text looked, and even there was this PC-ROM Spider-Man game that was like a sort of remaster of the Sony PS1 Spider-Man game with the version of the supposedly sort of then at the time new movie at the time yet. And I remember some of those images very well, but I can't find those images anywhere like on eBay or so now, so I can't find that. So it's hard to tell because it's been over 15 years, people, and knowing that this is like long before we ever had YouTube and all this social media and stuff. Because man, can you believe if we had social media back in the early 2000s when this stuff happened, everybody would have went nuts. But knowing again, this is the decade where we do have all of that. Back then in the early 2000s, we didn't have any of that. We just had internet, email, and AOL until it died off, and then other things. And then as soon as I remember seeing throughout the spring of 2002, I do remember seeing some TV spots and other marketing promotions for this movie. And then I found out, yes, Spider-Man has now a movie for some reason. Yeah, as a 10-year-old kid, and again, part of my nostalgia, I was kind of excited that Spider-Man was going to get a movie, because if X-Men was successful as a big screen live action feature, so was Spider-Man. And thus, the summer of 2002 was like the summer of 1989 for those who saw Tim Burton's Batman. And to be honest though, and I have been saying this for years, my experience of seeing Spider-Man in a feature film for the first time is just, well, the summer of 2002, though, was very reminiscent to those who were kids in the late 80s, early 90s when Tim Burton released his first Batman, which starred Michael Keaton, and 1989 summer of that year was the summer of Batman, much like how summer 2002 was for me with Spider-Man. And actually, as a matter of fact, Spider-Man 2002 was like the Batman 1989 of my generation. And I'm really obliged, and I'm glad and proud that I grew up in that boom of the 2000s when Spider-Man graced to the screens with his very first feature film debut. And even those who were kids or preteens and stuff back in 2002 must have also had the glorious, experience of seeing Spider-Man on the big screen for the first time. And I thank Sam Raimi and Sony, and back when Sony didn't up the property, to actually give us a Spider-Man movie that was going to, bring a big boom in the comic book movies. And then the casting choices: Tobey Maguire, Kirsten Dunst, Willem Dafoe, James Franco, Cliff Robertson, rest in peace, Rosemary Harris, and even J.K. Simmons. I would never guess that the casting choices they had in this movie to start off the big screen journey of Spider-Man was actually the biggest experience ever. Now, in terms of the casting choice of Tobey Maguire, though, you see, as a kid, prior on with movies that I watched back in the late 90s and stuff, now, I didn't know who the heck Tobey Maguire was until I saw Spider-Man at some capacity. And then when I actually got to see this movie, and then after the movie came out, and I was like, I'm impressed with this guy playing the character, but I didn't know who Tobey was until all these years, until up to this point with Wikipedia and social media, looking up his past movie history, what movies and TV shows he's been on before Spider-Man, like The Cider House Rules and Pleasantville and Ice Storm, and did a voice role in the movie Cats and Dogs, albeit it was kind of here or there, and so on. And then as soon as when I saw Spider-Man, I knew this movie was going to make him a star, because past movie roles that Maguire had, now some of those movies were okay, some of them still hold up, like Cider House Rules in Pleasantville. And yeah, because back then I didn't know who Tobey was and then the following year after Spider-Man in 2003 came Seabiscuit, then 2004 Spider-Man 2 arrived, and then 2006 was The Good German, and then 2003, the film that actually made Tobey shy away from, the Hollywood spotlight for a couple years and such. And then here we are, and Tobey is like the more respected golden child of Hollywood, golden man child or something of Hollywood. And even though to this day, Tobey is still the best Peter Parker and Spider-Man, and regardless, I grew up with Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man. That's why I've always been a fan of Tobey for at this point for the last 15 years. But actually, years went off after Spider-Man 3 came around. Yeah, I know. Tomorrow is the 10th anniversary, and looking at the third, and looking back on the third movie, though, I'm like, after two innocent romps about a teenage or so 20-something-year-old superhero, then we get to a third movie who was supposed to be the most anticipated of the entire trilogy, but ended up being a massive venomous turd that just left a major sour taste in a lot of people's mouths. And I understand, if you like Spider-Man 3, good for you. But basically, though, right until we probably get Spider-Man 3.1 or whatever. But however, though, I just thought that I just thought this movie is what got me into the character and what got me into the actor, though. And thus, even though for years, aside from, yeah. And then as for the other actors outside of Maguire, then there was Kirsten Dunst as Mary Jane Watson. All right, guys. Now, to be honest, though, Kirsten did her best only in the first Spider-Man. And that's just my personal opinion. But when it came to Spider-Man 2 and Spider-Man 3, however, oh my God. I mean, well, Mary Jane was, Peter, Mary Jane, and even Harry have been around for 3 movies, as well as their other supporting characters, like Peter's Aunt May and J. Jonah Jameson, and even, Brandt, sorry, and several others. And even the illustrious Bruce Campbell making cameos in these 3 movies. Well, I'll get the Bruce Campbell later, trust me. And as soon as Kirsten Dunst, as a kid, I had been a little familiar to Kirsten Dunst. Remember that movie Small Soldiers? That PG-13 rated version of Toy Story? Yeah, good times. Better than these. And back when Kirsten Dunst was a little resonated to me a bit. But Kirsten Dunst, man, I just, yeah. As a 10-year-old kid, I had a crush on Kirsten for a while. And then as soon as when the Spider-Man sequels arrived in 2004 and 2007 respectively, then I kind of like, her Mary Jane comes off more of a bitchy bitch in the bitchy bitch in the sequels than in the first one. Because in the sequels, I mean, I understand her story arc in the trilogy was wanting to be an actress, and it didn't pay off well. Came Spider-Man 3, but it did pay off somewhat well in the second movie. But the third movie, however, in terms of her arc there, being an actress, singing, you know, horribly according to what the critics felt of her. Yeah, that goes to show that Mary Jane in this trilogy was kind of wasted for the rest of the sequels. But although, you know, shockingly, you know, every time you see Spider-Man save Mary Jane at the end of these three movies, you know, actually this movie in particular started the trend of why Mary Jane keeps getting captured by the villain of the main villain of each movie, and then every time they kidnap Mary Jane, this has been a complete trope in the Raimi Trilogy of Spider-Man. She keeps getting kidnapped, and it's up for Peter/Spider-Man to save her from the villain. So because, you know, again, Peter or Spider-Man cares for Mary Jane, and Mary Jane just cares for, you know, with Mary Jane in question, if she likes Peter Parker more or Spider-Man. That's been a big $1 million question for her throughout the entire trilogy. And, you know, again, it's like, because you know how that same old formulaic thing of superhero with the love interest that they think is the hottest and want to her is, excuse me, sorry. But again, and also, not to mention, Mary Jane and her nipples in the movie. Was that really necessary? Yes, I understand. From what I've heard, Kirsten Dunst was around like age 18 or so at the time the first Spider-Man movie was made and released. And around that time, Tobey was in his mid to late 20s when he did the first one too. He was around like 28. Tobey was like around 27 or 28 when he did the first movie, while Kirsten was like 17. It was like 18 years old. Oh, so what? Okay, well, they should have went with an actress that was around the same age as Tobey. Kirsten was a little too young. Now, I would have liked it if originally Kirsten Dunst could have been Gwen Stacy, but remember, Raimi wanted to go with the Peter Parker Mary Jane relationship. That's the more popular relationship between the two characters in Spider-Man's universe. Because Mary Jane is a more popular love interest for Spider-Man, and I don't blame them. I mean, choosing Mary Jane over Gwen Stacy was something, but that's why over 10 years later at the time of, well, the Amazing Spider-Man, they decided to use Gwen Stacy in the first reboot rather than Mary Jane, because when Mark Webb did The Amazing Spider-Man in 2012, he didn't want to use Mary Jane. Although The Amazing Spider-Man 2, we could have gotten Shailene Woodley as Mary Jane, but no, those films and that continuity had the focus on Peter and Gwen Stacy's relationship, while the Raimi universe focused on Peter and Mary Jane's relationship. So there's that. And then, yeah, I mean, and also, I've also preferred the MJ from the first Spider-Man than in the sequels, because this Mary Jane, in terms of hair color though, the red hair, she seemed more accurate to her original comic book counterpart with the natural red hair, whereas in Spider-Man 2 and 3, her red hair coloring is just so icky. And not to mention, it just comes off making her look like a scarlet colored haired character in the third one. But in Spider-Man 2, when you look at Mary Jane's hair in the second one, it's like with half of that red hair, it makes her look like she's trying to resemble Gwen Stacy a little bit, with Kirsten's natural blonde hair showing in the second one, and that's not very good. And also, like I said, I prefer the Mary Jane from the first movie, and forget the Mary Jane that we had in the sequels. Enough said, because the Mary Jane that Kirsten played in the sequels just came off as a bitch. The next character in the series that I actually also had admired by, that we've been following throughout that entire trilogy alone, Harry Osborn, played by Hollywood's current overused actor and lovable douchebag, James Franco. Actually, the more lovable douchebag right now is Ryan Reynolds because Deadpool. But actually, James Franco, actually. Yeah, also like Tobey Maguire, I didn't know who the hell James Franco was until Spider-Man and him playing Harry Osborn. Peter's best friend, who later also accuses Spider-Man for killing his dad at the end. Whoops. Yeah, and throughout the trilogy, though, Harry has been, I don't know. I mean, the way how his, body language and attitude was in this movie, and then throughout the trilogy, the way how he's been acting pretty estranged by his dad, and then we know that his dad was a very busy man and very important man, and then, Harry was just there in the first movie, but by the time the end of the first movie, after the final battle between Spider-Man and the Green Goblin, then all of a sudden Harry just wanted to now want to acknowledge, thinking, oh, Spider-Man killed his dad, when no one, until that revelation at the end of Spider-Man 3, and the climactic battle of that movie, where, Bernard, whatever his name, who serves, who once served the Osborn household as their butler, and also, or advocate, or whatever the crap. When Bernard told Harry the real truth, what happened to Norman at the end of the first movie, after his, when he was the Goblin trying to destroy his best friend, who is, spoilers, Spider-Man, Harry had to finally know the truth in the third movie, and that's one of the few scenes I did like from Spider-Man 3. Now, if the truth would have been told sooner, like in the second movie, Harry wouldn't have this kind of vendetta against Peter and Spider-Man, because he believed that Spider-Man killed them. Spider-Man, and also like Batman, have that mentality of Batman, like Batman has with society, that Spider-Man is not a murderer. Just like Batman. Batman does not kill people. And I know that Morrell in modern superhero iterations of those two characters alone in the respective franchises. But as for Peter though, as for Harry though, that one scene that I knew that even 15 years ago, watching this movie for the first time on DVD, no less, I didn't get to see it in theaters because, well, everybody was going all nuts with the movie when it was in theaters during the summer of '02. So, but as soon as after that scene where Harry, when at, his father's funeral, Harry had muttered to himself, telling Peter, "One day Spider-Man will pay. I swear on my father's grave, Spider-Man will pay." So yeah, he was going around saying that because it has resonated to me. And even throughout Spider-Man 2, this is where things started to unravel into his big, character development, in terms of still wanting to seek revenge against Spider-Man, wanting to wait the day for him to know who the guy is behind the mask, and knowing he finds out, later after in Spider-Man 2, of course, when Octavius brings Spider-Man as opposed to dead, chained up in the Osborn mansion, and when Octavius leaves to take the train. Yeah, don't worry, I'll do a Spider-Man 2 rant soon. And as soon as and then pulls the mask off and then finds out his friend is Spider-Man. But again, I'm supposed to talk about the first movie. Instead, I want to talk about the entire Raimi trilogy instead. But actually, I got to focus on one movie first and then do the other two later. Then comes to our main villain of the first movie, it's himself, Norman Osborn, aka the Green Goblin, by Willem Dafoe. Now, Willem Dafoe, like the rest of the actors outside of Kirsten Dunst, Willem Dafoe, I didn't know who he was until just Spider-Man, and then I had to go back and forth to what movies he has also been else in. And yes, even around the time of Spider-Man, I did watch an episode of The Simpsons where he voiced that drill sergeant that Bart Simpson goes to military school at. And yeah, of course, I did watch The Simpsons when, back when, there was nothing else on TV. And I'm still to this day not a fan of The Simpsons. And even though I have watched those earlier episodes because, again, back when I was, such and such. But anyway, Norman Osborn, Willem Dafoe's Norman Osborn, the one way I would describe it is that, yeah, he seems normal to some extent. But as soon as when he starts unleashing his dark side, in terms of, being forced and threatened to, shut down his company of Oscorp by the military in terms of performance enhancers, you mean to tell me Norman Osborn is a drug addict? And then as soon as he uses those performance enhancers to his, to his device that will make him go insane to unleash his demon, well, the demon within, that being the Green Goblin. And then because society wants to outcast Norman for being such and such, because I think this is a sign that Norman has been abusing drugs, and I think that's why his again, I think his father was a drug addict, hence that's why he's been having some type of schizophrenia or something throughout the movie. And then also, and hence the part of him talking to himself in the mirror. And then well, as a kid 10 years ago, that shit kind of creeps me out. And 15 years later, at the age of 24 going on 25, looking back on this, I'm like, nah. Yeah, I say it's way over the top. When I was a kid, I was a little frightened by this crap of, Norman Osborn talking to himself because, doing that Golluming effect. Hell, in Spider-Man 2, Otto Octavius goes through that when he becomes being part of his dark side of losing his wife and his machine gets blown up. Again, we'll talk about Spider-Man 2 later. But as soon as when we get to, as soon as we get to the Green Goblin. All right, guys, for those who want to know about my thoughts on the Green Goblin suit from the 2002 movie, here's what I think. Now, many people over the last 15 years now, at the time of the film's release and after the movie's release, people keep saying the Green Goblin in this movie for some odd reason. Everybody keeps saying the Green Goblin in this movie looks like a damn Power Ranger villain. Considering I am a fan of Power Rangers, at the same time I'm a fan of Spider-Man and other Marvel properties. But why is it that the influence had to come out somewhere in terms of the resemblance of him looking like a Power Ranger villain. But I don't see the resemblance of that. I don't see no kinship or design aesthetic that reminds me of a Power Ranger villain. Hell, if he was like, let's say, a green version of Lord Zed, let's say, then I would be like, okay, well, he's kind of like a creepier or demented version of Lord Zed, or even Rita's brother, the dude with the skeleton and all that, the head and all that, and then just go or something, and then flies around in a glider, tries to kill Mary Jane, kill all the people in New York, and then also try to even kill Peter's Aunt May. What? Well, the Green Goblin was, well, actually, to be honest though, one of the reasons I've always loved the Green Goblin is because just think about it. Spider-Man versus the Green Goblin is like Batman versus the Joker. It makes a lot of sense because I just realized Spider-Man is very akin to Batman. Except Spider-Man is not a billionaire orphan who lost his parents, in his childhood and stuff, and all of that, but lives with his aunt. But Spider-Man lives with his aunt. Peter lived with his aunt and uncle and has a girlfriend, while Batman is just this guy who's a billionaire playboy who lost his parents, lives with his butler in the Wayne Manor and all of that, and then runs his family name's company, that being Wayne Enterprises, has Gotham City, a city where it's corrupted and all, and then you got all these mischief, and then you got all the and when there's fundraiser events, he goes out with all these multiple women, and having all these women suck Bruce's dick and all that, and whatever, and then and then the villains are out there trying to cause Batman some pain and all of that, and then after when Batman fights those villains, send them villains to Arkham Asylum, except Selena Kyle, and it's just well, that's Batman. Spider-Man was a totally different character. High school teenager, gets bit by a radioactive spider, lives with his aunt and uncle, has multiple love interests. At least Spider-Man can get laid, at least. Unlike you, Batman. And, also goes to high school or college in some incarnations. Has a great rogue gallery of villains, as equal as, like, the rogue gallery of villains Batman has, like Joker and Catwoman and Two-Face and Bane and Mr. Freeze and the Riddler and Ra's al Ghul. While Spider-Man has Green Goblin, Mysterio, Dr. Octopus, Venom, Sandman, the other Green Goblin, the Lizard, Electro, etc., and Hobgoblin. So and even Venom. So you have they're equal. They're very equal to one another, and that's why I have always had an admiration for both Batman and Spider-Man, because they're both alike. I've noticed that even following this movie, and at the time when it came out, I've had some sort of a connection to Batman and some essence with Spider-Man. Somewhat. But the difference is Batman is a dark superhero. sans the Adam West incarnation from the 60s or the Joel Schumacher movies, especially the one with the ice puns and the bat nipples. And Spider-Man is a lighthearted and sometimes dark, but mostly lighthearted superhero. Because, well, his world has always been lighthearted, but there are times where when there's something superstitious and dark about it, it's going to get superstitious and dark about it. Whether it's about Alistair Smythe and his Spider Slayer project with Oscorp, or the Kingpin wanting to, such and such, or with the Venom symbiote, or when Spider-Man bonds with the Venom symbiote, or something like that. So around the time, even when I got the film on DVD in November 2002, if you pop in disc 2, there's the Rogue Gallery where it gives you some brief histories and all bios about the villains and also in Spider-Man's world, including the one that is featured in this first installment of the film franchise. That being Mr. Green Goblin, sort of Power Ranger reject, villain wannabe reject. So, yeah. And also, I hate the fact that every time I know I've been... Excuse me. I know I've been talking about the Green Goblin long enough, but simply to the fact is, Green Goblin doesn't look like a Power Ranger villain to me. He looks like the Green Goblin, and that's that. Although I have seen rare images of, when they were adapting the Green Goblin to the big screen, they could have went with his comic book look, but it was later rejected. So whose idea was to make the Goblin all green and make him give him this? Well, now the armored Green Goblin design, I actually like it. Because, again, I understand they didn't want to go with the full comic book design because, again, things are not going to be adapted, properly from, comic to film sometimes when you do superhero movies. Some things of those characters' aesthetics are going to remain different, while when you adapt, have the full basis and faithfulness of the character, they have to stay true to the form from the original source material. At least Spider-Man still has his iconic costume design from the comics and whatnot. While the Green Goblin, although he has the face of what the Green Goblin is supposed to look, but his entire costume has left desired. So yeah, the Green Goblin suit in the film, I have to agree with everybody for the last 15 years now. He does look like a Power Ranger villain. Enough said. As for all the other actors in the film, the late Cliff Robertson as Peter's uncle. Yeah, I would say Cliff Robertson, even still to this day, is still a better Ben Parker than Charlie Sheen's dad in the first reboot. Sorry, but still, no hard feelings, Martin. But anyway, yeah, Cliff Robertson was more a better Uncle Ben than the Martin Sheen version, because you see, Cliff Robertson's Ben Parker, he was more like a father figure. It was more father figure like, regardless of him being Peter's uncle in his late 60s at the time. But at the time when Cliff Robertson worked on the first Spider-Man, he was in his early 70s at the time when he was on this movie. And I hate to forget the miss, though, sadly. Cliff Robertson passed away sometime in 2011 or 2012. Just almost near 10 years after the first Spider-Man movie was released. And also for those who may not know, Spider-Man 3 was Cliff Robertson's final movie appearance. And so it's just sad to see him gone. He was a good soul. He was a good guy, good man, even though I didn't know who he was until I looked up all his IMDb and Wikipedia credits and whatnot. And as for Rosemary Harris as Peter's Aunt May, now, before we had Marissa Tomei's Cougar MILF version of Aunt May with black hair and stuff in the MCU, or Sally Field's, naggy cunt like Aunt May in the Amazing movies, Rosemary Harris's Aunt May was more lighthearted and more motherly like to Peter, and as his aunt though. But again, she was actually the better Aunt May. And even though Sally Field, no offense to Sally Field, but I mean, I respect Sally Field as an actress, but her Aunt May in the Amazing Spider-Man movies was like, okay, well, Sally Field, I understand. She was, the only reason Sally Field was in The Amazing Spider-Man was because, remember the stories about Laura Ziskin dying from cancer, breast cancer, until her untimely death in 2011? The reason why Sally Field did Spider-Man when Mark Webb did his continuity of films Sally only did those two movies because, well, one of the two movies, because Laura Ziskin produced The Amazing Spider-Man, which was her final Spider-Man movie that she ever produced. And knowing that Sally had already acknowledged that The Amazing Spider-Man was going to be her last one that she ever produced after 4 movies and over almost a decade in a row. Ziskin had been diagnosed with breast cancer since 2004, which was the same year Spider-Man 2 happened. And yeah, I was shocked even when The Amazing Spider-Man was even about to happen, and then that teaser trailer went. Yeah, I'll talk about that more about, but so on. But I think the best part of the films, especially this movie in particular, was J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson, the head publisher of the Daily Bugle. You see, every time I see J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson, I crack up at every single joke he makes. And at least it's just every time I see J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson, I just love the way how he narrows down to each detail of the character, and while as head publisher of the Bugle, and his personal despising of Spider-Man, and then being so abusive to his co-workers, and then even and also at times, get a little harsh on Peter, when he tells him to bring pictures of Spider-Man to the Bugle, and then what's the word I'm looking for? It'll come back to me later. And then, berates him because, in Spider-Man, this picture of Spider-Man is crap. This picture is crap. This picture is crap. Much like in that scene, crap, mega crap. After, Spider-Man beats up a couple of thugs and all that. And then, because he's always had a despising spot for Spider-Man. And yeah, there was also some other memorable parts of the movie too. Yeah, I've talked enough about the cast. I've been wasting time. Sorry. Well, there has been lots of great. Well, to be honest, though, for 15 years in retrospect, there was lots and lots of great moments from this movie. First scene being that wrestling match between Spider-Man and, believe it or not, the late Randy Macho Man Savage. Macho Madness! And Buzzsaw is ready! I got you for 3 minutes! 3 minutes of playtime! Yeah, I know. Rest in peace, Macho Man. And, and especially that joke when Spider-Man made fun of his outfit in the wrestling ring. That's a cute outfit. Did your husband give it to you? It just still resonates to me to this day why he said that. The second scene is the even darker when things get really dark when it came to Peter's uncle's death. The scene where Peter chases down his uncle's killer. And again, Dennis Carradine, who was the killer of Uncle Ben in this movie, is actually still the true killer of his uncle. I don't know why they brought it back in Spider-Man 3 and tried to reverse the origins of events and just altering the timeline and make it look like, Sandman, Flint Marko, killed Peter's uncle in the third one. Bullshit! Sorry. The scene where Peter chases his uncle's killer is also a powerful scene. Because again, I just love the way how this movie narrows down Spider-Man's origin to every great detail. Whereas The Amazing Spider-Man just misses the point, even though it tells the events differently of how Peter became Spider-Man, but such and such. We'll get to that movie another time. And then that just really cuts it right there. The third favorite part of the movie was Spider-Man's first encounter with the Green Goblin at the World Unity Festival for the first time, and throughout the movie in general. This is where the movie gets to its major action sequence. Outside of the first action scene with Spider-Man chasing his uncle's killer, came the first major supervillain battle in this movie with Spider-Man and the Green Goblin. And Peter saving Mary Jane, because this is again, it's been a staple throughout the trilogy. After Green Goblin leaves and says, "We'll meet again, Spider-Man," and then Spider-Man saves Mary Jane from falling to her death. And and also, I've also noticed something I never caught on when watching the original films. Raimi has always been a fan of the 1960s, 70s era of Spider-Man, right? Okay, so what I've noticed is that Raimi had also been inspired by Superman for some reason. The Superman films by Richard Donner. The first movie, there was just so many homages to those movies. I would never guess there would be homages to the Christopher Reeve Superman in a Spider-Man movie where you have an actor that, where you have these actors, as ensemble as it is. No wonder Roger Ebert in his review said this is one of the best superhero movies he's seen since Superman, because it just has that vibe of Christopher Reeve's Superman in it. But again, in a Sam Raimi style of, superhero movies with Spider-Man, it's just you get that vibe. I mean, if the first movie was a lighthearted, coming of age, becoming a superhero story, this movie did that. If Superman 2 had the hero struggle with this balance of real life and his real life and with his superhero life and his love life, Spider-Man 2 did that. If Superman 3 had the superhero go through his dark side, hell, Spider-Man 3 did it. And ignoring the fact Spider-Man 4 never happened, so it would have never emulated, so it could have almost emulated Superman 4 to some extent. So yeah, I see the vibe and the resemblance. And then the fourth favorite part of the movie would have to be when Spider-Man and the Goblin was fighting in that burning building, and I thought that was really cool. And and especially with the CG twists and turns. And however, I do also like the final battle between the two on the bridge, and then into that broken, abandoned warehouse district building place where the Goblin dies at the end. So yeah, there was lots and lots of great moments. I know I've been going on for almost an hour with this retrospective. That's how I did and also ended up, caused me to get copyright claims on my Batman movie retrospectives, and that's why I took those down. But I hope I don't get any of these due to my retrospective, because I'm not watching the movie the same time I'm doing this retrospective here. Now, as for other miscellaneous things about the film in terms of my retrospective on the movie, the visual effects, for the most part, were okay for a 2002 superhero movie. Again, this is where CGI really takes over in Hollywood. I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, well, looking at the CG effects in Spider-Man, however, for a 2002 superhero movie, the CG effects feel like it's effects you've seen in mid to late 1990s movies like Independence Day and Men in Black, and even probably Godzilla 1998. Even probably The Matrix. Every time you just look at these CG effects in this movie, it looks like something out of a movie from the 90s, the late 90s. Hell, even the CG effects from Starship Troopers even. But every single time when I just see those effects, I'm like, oh my god. Well, yeah, to be honest though, Raimi doesn't really care for CGI when he did the first movie. That's why it came the Spider-Man sequels of his trilogy. The films relied more on CG effects and also still had practical effects in common. And even though the CG effects in the sequels got better over time than in the first one did, because in the first movie he didn't want to do CGI he didn't want to use any CGI much often, besides for on occasion. And then however, there have been some practical effects, and there was lots and lots of practical effects. Hell, even when Raimi did the Evil Dead trilogy, there were practical effects and some, yeah, even though, yeah, the stop motion effects in the Evil Dead trilogy still scares the out of me still to this point. But as for Spider-Man though, the CG effects still hold up to some extent. But mostly where it shows where the fakeness of CG comes in is when Spider-Man does some moves, but actually it would make sense for Spider-Man. Well, it's a lot easier to animate Spider-Man in CG when he's swinging around the city, because they have a practical person, much like in the Nicholas Hammond Spider-Man TV series that didn't last long in the 70s. It would be a little bit daunting to have an actual person swinging around the city and they will get hurt, and then so it's best to have Spider-Man in CGI, because it just makes more sense to have him in CG than have an actual person wearing the Spider-Man costume swinging around and then get hurt, flying in the air, because, again, humans can't fly unless they're mutated. And yeah, kudos to John Dykstra for the visual effects and his visual effects team over in Sony ImageWorks, however. Now, what I think a lot of people have been waiting for the last 50 minutes of my retrospective and remaster on my movie rants of these movies is me talking and ranting about the movie score, however. Danny Elfman, who we may know for doing lots and lots of Tim Burton film scores, he did a film score for Spider-Man. Yeah, considering I was 10 years old in 2002, when I was born in 1992 when Batman Returns happened. So it's been over 10 years at this point that Elfman has not done a music score for for a superhero movie in over 10 years at the time. Yeah. After Batman, it's been over 10 years at that time in 2002, 15 years ago, where Elfman had ever contributed a score for a superhero movie. Since, well, which that being Batman Returns. You know, coincidentally, Batman Returns came out the same year I was born, 1992. Spider-Man came out 2002. I was 10 years old at the time. So it's been time flew, guys. I mean, it's like, oh my God, it's unbelievable. Yeah. As for Danny Elfman's music for Spider-Man, this is one of the reasons why I became a complete Danny Elfman music freak. Yeah, I love the Batman. I love this music for the Tim Burton Batman films, but his music for Spider-Man is what influenced me to make music scores for my movies in the first place. He's one of the few composers that was very influential, following Hans Zimmer for Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy, to ever, inspire me to make my own music. And I just think that the musical voice he has with the traditional orchestra elements and electronical, elements integrated to his music score, it's one of the few reasons why I've always liked Elfman's work for Spider-Man. Now, as for the music for Spider-Man 2, sure, yeah, some of the music he did for Spider-Man 2 was good, but half and most of that work, well, again, we'll talk about Spider-Man 2 next time. And I just think it's really fascinating why the heck that he did such a well-integrated film score. I've always liked that music. I mean, with themes about Spider-Man and then themes about Peter's power, responsibility, the love theme, and the theme song and his theme music for the Green Goblin. I've always liked that. Hell, I mean, listen to the music from the movie alone is better than listen to the music without watching the movie while the music is playing. Sometimes it's best to listen to a film score without watching the movie alone, because it's kind of a better way of doing it, because when you hear a theme song from the theme of the movie play, it just gives you that sort of inspiration of if you were in that listen to, this is what I love about music scores to movies. When you listen to a film score, it makes you feel as though you're already in that experience in that movie, already replaying those events that have already happened in those movies. And even when I listen to listen to the music in Spider-Man or Spider-Man 2, I just get that vibe. However, his music still holds up to some extent, but I came to come up to be so fond with later music for Spider-Man for films like, Christopher Young's contributions of Spider-Man in Spider-Man 3, and even the late James Horner's music for The Amazing Spider-Man. I didn't care much for Hans Zimmer's music for The Amazing Spider-Man 2 that much. And hell, I'm even surprised one of my other favorite composers, aside from Elfman, Michael Giacchino, has been assigned to do the music for Spider-Man Homecoming. Unbelievable. And also, let's not forget that Spider-Man also had, oh my God, all of this music from Sam Raimi directing, Danny Elfman doing the music, Tobey Maguire playing the character, and then it's just, oh my God, 15 years, this has been like, man, I just can't believe my life has changed with the way how I see superhero movies and movies in general forever. And I just think that that's one of the reasons why I've always been, to this day, 15 years later, I have now finally become a big Spider-Man fan. So yeah, that's been a lot. And also, of course, I still have my copy of the video game based on the movie for my PlayStation 2. Yeah, 15 years with my PS2 as well. Man, I can't believe I've had the game for so long. Yeah, the game, however, was still sandbox style like the two PS1 games I've had of Spider-Man growing up. But it was better with better graphics, and the gameplay can sometimes be lanky. And the missions were the level missions were okay and stuff. They still hold up. And the voice acting is mixed. Oh yeah, I stupidly forgot Bruce Campbell. Before I leave this video in retrospective, so I can do Spider-Man 2 next time in retrospective order. Bruce Campbell. I forgot Bruce Campbell. I can't believe I totally skipped him out of my retrospective here. Yeah, Bruce Campbell has done cameos in all three of Raimi's Spider-Man movies. Because knowing that Campbell has been a longtime colleague of Sam Raimi since the Evil Dead movies, but yeah, Bruce Campbell in the first movie does the ring announcer when Spider-Man comes into the wrestling ring with Bonesaw McGraw. And Bruce Campbell is a delight. Following Spider-Man, I didn't even know who the hell Bruce Campbell was until this point, 15 years ago. Here I am 15 years later looking back on the history of Sam Raimi's movies and all that, and Bruce Campbell, and it just, oh my God, Evil Dead, and oh my God, man. Bruce Campbell is just hilarious. I mean, especially in association with Spider-Man, though. I just never guessed that. I think that's what made this movie special, was have somebody related to Sam Raimi who's been with Sam for a long time, and then have him in a Spider-Man movie or movie franchise. And that is real something, guys. Hell, I mean, as a Power Rangers fan, I wouldn't be surprised if we ever had a Bruce Campbell cameo in a Power Rangers movie. Yeah, I would love to see that happen. So yeah, anyway, Spider-Man 2002 still holds up as one of my favorite superhero movies ever, and along with Spider-Man 2 as well. 15 years later, and I still think it's one of the best Spider-Man movies to date. But it seems that, though, with the sequels around, and of course the reboots and this other reboot for the MCU, it seems as though Spider-Man 1's popularity just, you know, in terms of nostalgia, though, yeah, there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot to discuss. I can go all day talking about this movie, but I can't. Now, the original movie rant video of the movie of me discussing the first Spider-Man movie was a little so short. Watch the original video again. I'll give you a link to it later. And to be honest, though, in my remaster of this, I've gone on for an hour ranting about the first movie. So, what is there to say about this? Spider-Man was solid, a great film, great start to a film trilogy and the film franchise before, again, back when Sony didn't f up the character and, you know, all that stuff, and you know what happened there. And I really think that the movie had great characterization of all the characters present from the source material, a great faithful interpretation of Spider-Man from the comics, even though I've never really read any of the original Amazing Spider-Man comics from the 60s, 70s and such, because they were way before my time. Though I do acknowledge there have been Amazing Spider-Man comics back in the 90s, though. But I have also, at the same time, also read an issue or two of the Ultimate Spider-Man comic books back in 2001, 2002, however, at the time when this movie came out. I mean, watching this movie gives me so much nostalgia, as well as Spider-Man 2, because actually the Raimi movies give us more nostalgia than these newer Spider-Man, you know, films with their actors. Yeah, sure, Andrew Garfield was fine, but again, Tobey is still a better Peter Parker and Spider-Man. And Tom Holland, okay, it seems like now with Andrew gone, no longer as Spider-Man, it's going to be hard for me to like Tom Holland. Yeah, Tom Holland, again, was great as Spider-Man in Captain America Civil War, but, you know, cameo-wise, but I'm not quite sure right now about Homecoming. I'll give you my thoughts on Homecoming once the movie is released, and probably way later into the year. So yeah, this movie, along with Blade and X-Men, gave us new life. Gave Hollywood new life to the superhero genre, and as well as new faith. Because after all, after so many years after Batman and Robin destroyed the superhero genre, Blade and X-Men and Spider-Man brought back the new life. Now, after Spider-Man, things would also get even much better when we come back and discuss the film that actually is the way better installment over the first movie, and of the trilogy, why it's one of the most lauded and greatest installments of the trilogy, as we talk about the next movie of the series next time.